Monday, November 10th, 1975. The Edmund Fitzgerald is caught in a storm and listing badly. Captain McSorley, the ship's commander, is desperately trying to get to a safe harbor, but her radio antenna has been knocked out and she's sailing blind. Her hull groans under the strain of the elements, until finally, disaster. The previous day, the Edmund Fitzgerald had been moored in Superior, Wisconsin at the Burlington Northern Railroad dock. At 729 feet, the ship was one of the largest to sail the Great Lakes. She was a workhorse, capable of hauling incredible amounts of ore while keeping her crew warm and comfortable. The Mighty Fitz, as she was affectionately named, was good at her duties. The weather that day was unusually warm, and the crew were happy to be able to work in temperate conditions. The crew worked to remove the ship's rectangular, 7-ton hatch covers. On board, there were 21 11-foot by 48-foot hatches. Each one was fastened down by 68 individual clamps. Her cargo consisted of 3 holds, each divided by screen bulkheads, a non-watertight wall. By the time loading finished in the early afternoon, the ship had 26,116 long tons of taconite aboard. Taconite being an unprocessed form of iron ore. After loading the cargo, the crew began the process of cleaning the deck and securing the ship's hatches. By industry standards, the ship was still young. Construction on the ship, then known as Hull 301, began in Detroit in August 1957. The Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company was a heavy investor in the iron and minerals industries, so they decided they would order their own ship. She would be named after the CEO of Northwestern Mutual, Edmund Fitzgerald. She launched on June 7, 1958, to a crowd of over 10,000 spectators. By 1975, she was just 18 years old, young for a Great Lakes vessel. The ship departed Wisconsin on schedule. Ernest McSorley, the ship's captain, overlooked this departure from the bridge. McSorley, described as a company man, prided himself on delivering his cargo on time and as cheaply as possible. He was a heavy weather captain, willing to guide his ship through any conditions to get to port on time. But he was not a man of hubris. He respected the power of the lakes, especially at this late point in the season when the weather was unpredictable. McSorley was a good sailor. He had been one of the youngest captains on the Great Lakes when he was made commander of the Carrollton at age 38. He didn't drink or smoke, and he didn't tend to socialize with his crew. He was a sailor at heart, whose motivation seemed to be to do his job as well as he could while keeping his vessel, its cargo, and his crew safe. As the ship left the pier, the crew was still working to secure all the hatch clamps. Down on the docks, a car arrived, and a woman and 2 children got out. This was Janice Armagost, the wife of Mike Armagost, a sailor on the Edmund Fitzgerald. She had taken her 2 young children to see their dad's ship depart. Janice could not see Mike on the deck. The mother and her children watched the ship depart, not knowing they would never see their father again, and they were some of the last people to ever see the Edmund Fitzgerald afloat. Two hours after the Edmund Fitzgerald left Superior, another ship, the Arthur M. Anderson, left Two Harbors, Minnesota. The Anderson also had a full load of taconite pellets. Captain Jesse Bernie Cooper, a 38-year veteran of the Great Lakes, was on the bridge. As his ship left the breakwater, he could see another ship on the lake behind him. This was the Fitzgerald, which Cooper knew would soon overtake the Anderson as she was the faster of the two ships. The two captains knew there was a storm forecasted, and neither took this lightly. They discussed their options over the radio together. Lake Superior is one of the largest and deepest Great Lakes. It spans 350 miles in length from shore to shore. It has the greatest surface area of any fresh body of water in the world, and it's roughly 10% of the entire world's supply of fresh water. It is a massive body of water, and Captain McSorley knew he had nearly 2 full days of sailing ahead of him. By early evening on November 9th, the ship had encountered deteriorating conditions. The wind was blowing and the seas were choppy, but to the crew of both ships, this was business as usual. The night would bring increasing rains and wind. The waves increased to 10 feet. Visibility was down. The barometric pressure continued to fall as the storm inched closer. The weather reports that came in from the shore were actually not as severe as weather readings being taken aboard both vessels. It was possible that they were in the worst of it. In May of 1953, an ore carrier on Lake Superior, the Henry Steinbrenner, sank when a hatch cover gave way in high seas. The ship departed Wisconsin in pleasant conditions, like the Edmund Fitzgerald, but encountered a severe storm. A large wave swept over the deck and took a cargo hatch with it. The water quickly flooded the holds, and there was nothing left to keep her buoyant. The ship went down quickly, and while some crew were able to escape in lifeboats, 17 sailors perished. The Coast Guard report noted that the heavy seas dislodged the after 3 hatch covers, permitting flooding of the cargo hold, and that the ship had previously been deemed seaworthy. A ship can only take so much from the waves before it loses buoyancy. In the early hours of November 10th, the National Weather Service updated its forecast, and Captain McSorley considered a change of course. By taking a more northeastern route, the ship might be shielded partially by the Canadian shore. At 3 a.m., the Edmund Fitzgerald passed the Arthur M. Anderson. Slowly, as the rains and winds increased, so did the distance between the two vessels. The rain would soon turn to snow as the temperatures dropped. The ship creaked as she rocked in the waves. Her extreme length compared to her width and height meant that she was built to withstand incredible tolerances. On this day, those tolerances would be pushed to their limits. All morning the weather was bad. The ship took a beating, until suddenly, the storm broke. The Fitzgerald sailed in moderate seas under sunny skies. This was the eye of the storm. The crew knew what was ahead of them. As the storm moved away, they'd be facing the toughest part of their trip. The sky grew dark again, and it began to snow. 12-foot waves began striking the ship. By mid-afternoon, the ship was starting to head south to the Sioux Locks. At this point, Captain McSorley had options for which route to take, and decided to pass by the small Caribou Island. This area is risky due to the presence of underwater shoals. A fully loaded ship, at full draft, bouncing around on the waves, would be a dangerous proposition in waters filled with shallow rocks. The Edmund Fitzgerald sailed on, her captain aware of the dangers. On the Arthur M. Anderson, Captain Cooper watched the radar, fearful of the route that the Edmund Fitzgerald had been taking. So much so that he pointed it out to his first mate. Whether the Fitzgeralds struck the shoal at Caribou Island or not will likely never be known. What is known is that something happened at this point which mortally wounded the ship. By 3:35 p.m., only minutes after observing the Fitzgerald on the radar, Captain McSorley called Cooper to report a problem. A fence rail had come down, some vents tore off, and a list was developing. Both of the functioning pumps on the Edmund Fitzgerald were running to dispel excess water from the holds. Shelter for the two ships was still 4 or 5 hours away. 20 minutes later, the ship suffered even more damage. Her radar antenna snapped off in the winds, causing the ship to sail completely blind. McSorley called the Arthur M. Anderson and asked for assistance in navigating these waters. The Anderson was still several miles back, but trying to navigate these waters blind in a damaged ship was dangerous. Sensing his ship was in peril, McSorley spent the next hour sending out several phone calls, including to the U.S. Coast Guard. While on the phone, McSorley sounded increasingly desperate and could also be heard shouting, "Don't allow anybody on deck," to his crew. To add to the difficulty, the Lightfish Bay lighthouse was experiencing a power outage, meaning that the crew needed radar to see the shore. McSorley was desperate, but his ship could still be saved at this point. Water was now entering his ship freely through hatch covers, open vents, and other damage topside. By 7 p.m., the ship was just 12 miles from Whitefish Bay. She only had 90 minutes until she was in the relative safety of the harbor. She was listing heavily and had lost most of her freeboard. She was dangerously low in the water, running blind and out of options. The waves were sweeping over her deck. The ship was coming apart. As Gordon Lightfoot said, the minutes were turning into hours. 20 to 30-foot waves were crashing at the ship, making her hull creak and shudder. Blinding snow fell. There would be no distress call. Captain McSorley's final words over the radio were, "We are holding our own." Most likely, this is what happened. One large wave hit the Fitzgerald, pushing her nose below the surface and overwhelming her already flooded cargo holds. Her pilot house windows blew in, and water pushed the crew backward. All of her small pellets of iron ore shifted forward, pushing her bow further down. Another large wave hit the ship, but at this point the ship was already heading down. At the back of the ship, the propeller continued to spin. Frigid water flooded the ship, and the crew was likely pushed up against bulkheads, unable to move. In this area of the lake, the ship was longer than the lake is deep. The bow rammed the bottom of the lake, which ripped the hull in two and caused the stern, now violently filling with water, to separate and land on the bottom upside down. Hatch covers blew out, scattering taconite everywhere. He gave no indication that he was worried, or that he had a problem, or that there was something he couldn't cope with, Captain Cooper later said. The Arthur M. Anderson was 10 miles behind the Edmund Fitzgerald when she sank. The crew didn't even realize the ship had gone down. Captain Cooper, who had briefly been away from the wheelhouse, returned and peered into the horizon. "Where is the Fitzgerald?" he asked his crew. No one had seen the ship in hours. Their only way of guiding it through the storm was through use of radar. But now, she had vanished from the radar screen. The storm was beginning to clear, and the Edmund Fitzgerald's lights should have been visible. Captain Cooper first called the U.S. Coast Guard in Sault Ste. Marie at 7:39 p.m. on Channel 16, the distress frequency. They instructed him to call back on Channel 12 because they wanted to keep their emergency channel open and they were having difficulty with their communication systems. Cooper tried several attempts to contact the Coast Guard, who didn't answer until 7:54 p.m. At 8:25 p.m., Cooper again had to call the U.S. Coast Guard to express his concern about the Edmund Fitzgerald, and by 9:03 p.m. reported her missing. A search was finally organized, hampered, of course, by the weather. Aircraft and helicopters combed the area, but only some debris and wrecked lifeboats could be found. The ship captured national headlines when it sank. No Mayday was transmitted. No lifeboats launched. 29 men lost their lives, leaving behind grieving families. People argued whether the ship should have even taken to the sea in a storm that rough. Captain McSorley's leadership was brought into question. Why didn't he radio in a Mayday? The U.S. Coast Guard Marine Board issued the following conclusion. The nature of Great Lakes shipping, with short voyages, much of the time in very protected waters, frequently with the same routine from trip to trip, leads to complacency and an overly optimistic attitude concerning the extreme weather conditions that can and do exist. The Marine Board feels that this attitude reflects itself at times in deferral of maintenance and repairs, in failure to prepare properly for heavy weather, and in the conviction that since refuges are near, safety is possible by, quote, running for it. The loss of the Fitzgerald would continue to haunt Captain Cooper for the rest of his life. In the days following the sinking, the wreck was located. The wreck of the ship tells the story of the ship's final moments, with her bridge windows shattered, her hull snapped, and her iron ore cargo littered all over. The day after the wreck, Mariners Church in Detroit rang its bell 29 times, one for each life lost. The church continues to hold an annual memorial, reading the names of the crewmen and ringing the church bell. Investigations into the tragedy only yielded more questions. For more on the investigation of why the ship sank, check out my video on the Edmund Fitzgerald's Marine Board investigation. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. If you would like to see another ship or historical event covered, leave a comment below.